The hall of bound oaths had been built to hold the weight of vows, but it could not hold the weight of what Seneca was about to do. She stood in the antechamber behind the great northern doors, her fingers wrapped around the silver consort's circlet that had been set into her hair an hour ago. The metal sat on her head like a millstone. In the hall beyond, 1,000 voices waited, pack lords from the high reaches of Andreth, council elders in their long gray robes. The full court of Caravash, summoned to witness what they believed would be the formal naming of their next queen. They did not know she had come to give the circlet back. For 3 days she had carried the truth inside her chest like a swallowed coal, smiling at servants and nodding at petitioners and letting Varian press his lips to her wrist as if nothing in the world had changed. 3 days since she had seen the letters. They had been left for her to find. She understood that now. Tucked into a desk drawer in the king's private study, the one Varian had given her a key to himself, the one no one else was supposed to enter. Letters in his own hand, sealed with his own ring, written to Malus Halvest in a tone Seneca had not believed him capable of. My patience grows thin. The girl is useful only as long as the council believes the soul binding is real. The day after the reckoning, you will take your rightful place beside me. Until then, she must be made to feel chosen. She had read them 4 times. She had pressed her own hand to the parchment and tried to summon the ashen sight her grandmother had taught her, the gift of reading what living hands had left behind on dead objects. The sight had refused her. It did sometimes, when a thing was too painful to know. So she had gone to the only conclusion that fit, that the king who had put a blood mark on the inside of her wrist 6 months ago had been performing a careful play, that the soul binding she had felt thrumming between them every night was a script she had been recruited into without knowing, that she was a piece on a board. Her hand moved, unbidden, to her lower belly. Beneath the embroidered silk of her ceremonial dress, a different secret pressed itself against her palm. 2 months along, the court physician did not know. Varian did not know. No one knew except Seneca and the woman in Briarwen Hollow who had taught her how to count the moons. She had planned to tell him after the reckoning. Now she would not tell him at all. My lady? The herald's voice, soft through the door. The hall is ready. Seneca closed her eyes. Be hollow, she told herself. Be the empty bowl. Let the words pass through. She lifted the circlet from her head with both hands. The doors opened. The hall was a long blade of golden light and held breath. Pillars of black marble climbed toward a vaulted ceiling painted with the constellations of the old wolf faith. At the far end, on the raised dais of beaten silver and oak, Varian Costa stood waiting. The Alpha King of Andreth, the man she had loved with the whole stubborn weight of her body for one full turning of the year. He was magnificent. Black ceremonial cloak over a tunic the color of river ice, dark hair drawn back from a face that had been carved by some careless god in an unrepeatable hour. His eyes were the deep amber of pine resin held to a flame, and tonight they were fixed on her with the precise public warmth he had perfected. She had seen that look before. She understood now what it cost him to make it. The walk down the long center aisle took an eternity. Around her, the assembled court murmured at the sight of a queen-to-be holding her own circlet in her hands instead of wearing it. Seneca reached the foot of the dais. She did not climb the 7 steps. She turned, instead, to face the hall. 1,000 faces. The witnessing faces of a kingdom. My lords and ladies of Andreth, she said, and her voice did not shake, which surprised her. My elders. My king. She did not look at him when she said the last word. You were summoned here tonight to witness a reckoning, a soul binding made public, and a consort made queen. She lifted the silver circlet so the entire hall could see it. I have come to tell you that there will be no reckoning, the murmur died. I, Seneca of Briarwen Hollow, freely born and freely chosen, set down the claim that was offered to me. I renounce the consort's circlet. I renounce the blood mark made between myself and Varian, Alpha King of Andreth. I release him from any vow he believed himself to have made, and I release myself from any vow I believed I had received. Behind her, on the dais, she heard him draw breath to speak. She did not let him. I do this freely, she said, louder. I do this without coercion. I do this in the full sight of the gods who are said to watch the bound and the unbound alike. Let the witness be made, and let the bond be unmade. I am no longer the king's intended. I am no longer the king's anything. She set the circlet down on the lowest step of the dais. Her hand did not tremble. Then she turned, and for the first time since entering the hall, she looked at Varian. His face had gone the color of new ash. His mouth was open, but no sound came from it. His amber eyes were wide in a way she had never seen, as if some old certainty in him had been struck from underneath. He was reaching one hand toward her, just one, half extended, frozen. She had loved that hand. Seneca, he said, just her name. A whisper that reached her despite the size of the hall. Seneca, what have you done? For a moment, looking up at his stricken face, she almost faltered. Some animal part of her wanted to climb the 7 steps and press her forehead to his chest and weep. Some animal part of her had not yet finished believing the letters. She looked away. What was already done, she said quietly. Live well, my king. She walked back down the aisle alone. The court parted for her as if she were a sickness they were afraid to touch. At the great northern doors, 2 house guards stepped aside without orders. From the threshold, she heard a single broken sound that might have been her name a second time. She kept walking. The cold of the outer corridor hit her like a slap of clean water. Her servants were waiting where she had told them to wait, 2 girls with 2 satchels and a single dark cloak. They did not ask. She had told them not to ask. She let them pull the cloak around her shoulders, hood up, the silver of her hair tucked away. To the river gate, she said. Now, they moved. Behind her, somewhere deep in the palace, a sound began. Not a shout, not a horn, a low, rising note, gathering in the throat of something very large, building toward a howl that had not yet been let out. She did not let herself hear it. Through the river gate, through the sleet of an early spring night, into a waiting cart driven by a man she had paid in advance, Seneca of Briarwen Hollow vanished from the city of Caravash. She did not look up at the high tower where, had she lifted her eyes, she would have seen a single figure standing pressed against the leaded glass, both hands flat against it, watching her go. She did not see him slide down the glass to his knees. She did not hear the howl when it finally broke loose, a sound so raw that the wolves in the kennels below the tower threw back their heads and answered it, and the wolves in the city beyond threw back their heads, and the wolves in the forests beyond the city, until the whole of Andreth was singing one shared note of grief into a sky that did not know why. By the time the cart cleared the outer wall, the howling had spread to the hills. Seneca put her hand over her belly and closed her eyes. She had done what had to be done. She told herself this for the next 40 miles. 5 months passed before the kingdom found her. Hollowgate was the kind of village the maps did not bother with. 22 houses huddled around a stone bridge, a mill pond that froze hard in winter, a chapel with a leaning bell tower, and the wide green silence of the grey moor on every side. The villagers had asked her name when she arrived, and she had told them she was Wenna, a midwife's daughter from somewhere east, a young widow seeking work. They had not pressed her. The Greymoor folk were not a pressing people. By midsummer, Wenna had become the woman who lived in the small grey cottage at the edge of the eastern fields. She took in mending. She brewed remedies for fever and milk cough. She delivered 2 babies in her first month and lost neither. She refused payment from the poorest households and accepted eggs and bread from those who could spare them. And every night, when the cottage was quiet and the lamp was low, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her hand pressed flat to the small, hard curve of her belly. 6 months gone, then nearly 7. The kicks came in pairs now. 2 thumps, and then a pause, 2 thumps, and then a pause, as if a tiny foot were knocking on the inside of a door. Seneca had felt this rhythm under her palms before, in other women. She knew what it meant. She did not let herself say the word twins aloud, because saying it made the whole future too heavy to carry. She also did not let herself think about the blood mark on the inside of her wrist. It had not faded. By every law of soul-binding she had ever been told, a renounced bond should have gone gray within a week. The mark should have softened from its deep ink color to the faint silver of a healed scar, and within a month it should have been gone entirely. Hers had darkened. Some nights it pulsed with a slow, distant heat. Some nights it ached so sharply she had to wrap her wrist in a cold cloth to sleep. And on the worst nights, the ones when the wind came from the north, she could swear she felt something through it. A reaching, a blind, patient reaching, like a hand searching for hers in a dark room. She had decided that this was her own grief, made into a phantom by lonely nights and a body changing too fast. She was wrong. It was a Thursday in late summer when Pell came running. Pell was the miller's youngest, 11 years old and bright as a coin, with a habit of bringing Seneca the flower she paid for personally because she had decided Seneca was the most interesting woman in Hollowgate and did not intend to share her. She arrived at the cottage door out of breath, 2 spots of color high on her cheeks. "Wenna," she gasped. "There are men at the bridge." Seneca set down the mortar she had been grinding mint in. "What kind of men, Pell?" "King's men." The world did not tilt. The world did something quieter than that. It simply set itself a half step to the left of where it had been a moment before, and stayed there. "How many?" "3 on horses. One older one with gray in his hair. They are asking after a woman. A midwife who came in springtime alone." Pell's eyes were enormous. "Wenna, they have a drawing." Seneca placed both hands on the edge of her work table, very gently, and let the table take some of her weight. "A drawing of what?" "Of you." She sent Pell home with a kiss on the forehead and a strict instruction not to mention the cottage. Pell was 11 and had never held a secret of this size in her life. The cottage would be on the men's list before sundown. Seneca stood very still in the middle of her small front room and tried to think. The Halvists. The thought arrived fully formed. Of course it was the Halvists. She had not allowed herself to wonder, in 5 months, who had placed the letters in the king's desk for her to find. She had not allowed herself the question because the answer required her to admit that she had been moved across a board, and admitting that she had ruined a life that had not, perhaps, deserved to be ruined. The Halvists had wanted her gone. Lord Dreven and his daughter had wanted the consort's circlet on Melis's head from the day the Alpha King had first looked at a midwife from Briarwen Hollow with an unguarded face. The letters in Varian's hand, the seal, the phrasing. It was so easy in retrospect to forge those things if one had access to the king's private rooms, and the Halvists had had access for a generation. She had been a fool. She had been the kind of fool who made a public renunciation in a 1,000-witness hall. The kind who could not, now, simply walk back into the palace and say she had been mistaken. She felt the first true crack open inside her chest. Not heartbreak. Heartbreak had been the spring. This was something colder, sharper. The men outside were not coming to drag her back. They were coming because the Halvists had not been able to put Melis on the throne yet, and they could not put her there while Seneca was still alive somewhere with a blood mark and a belly full of an Alpha's children. She had to leave. She was halfway across the room toward her satchel when the knock came at her door. It was a polite knock. 3 measured strikes. Not the kicking in of an assassin's boot, not even the rap of a guard. "Mistress Wenna," a low voice called from the other side. An older man's voice, tired, careful. "My name is Oric Tarson. I serve the Alpha King of Andrith. I am alone, I am unarmed, and I would ask your leave to speak with you for 1/4 hour. Then I will go, whether you stay or whether you choose to flee." She stood frozen. "If you require a sign that I do not mean you harm," the voice went on, "I will tell you this. The mark on the inside of your right wrist has not faded, and I know that it has not, because the king's own blood mark has not faded either, and on certain nights it grows so hot he cannot keep his hand still. Open the door, mistress, or do not. But please believe that I have come to tell you the truth, and I have come a very long way to do it." For a long moment, Seneca could not feel her hands. Then she crossed the room, lifted the iron latch, and opened the door. The man on her threshold was perhaps 60, broad in the shoulders, his short beard the color of old iron. His dark green coat was travel-stained. His gray eyes were red-rimmed in a way that looked less like exhaustion and more like the aftermath of weeping. The 2 she could see were left at the bridge, on her honor, on his. He did not look like a man who had come to harm her. He looked like a man who had come to deliver news he was not sure she would survive hearing. "May I come in?" he said. She stepped back. Auric Tarson entered her cottage as if he were entering a chapel. He removed his gloves. He set his hat on the edge of her table. He did not sit until she gestured to the chair across from her own. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him. My lady, the letters were forged. Seneca did not move. The kitchen did not move. Even the kettle on the hob seemed to have stopped breathing. Forged. By Lord Drevenhalvist, in the king's hand. He has had the gift since his youth. He used it twice in his service before he turned it on his sovereign. Auric's gray eyes did not leave her face. I have proof. I will show it to you in any form you wish. The letters you read in the king's desk 3 days before the reckoning were planted there by Malus Halvist, who had access to her father's seal. The king has never written a letter to that woman in his life. She put one hand against her own throat. He let me go. He stood on the dais and let me set the circlet down and walk out, and he did not stop me. Auric's mouth tightened. He could not stop you, my lady. He had been struck dumb by your words. He thought, in that hour, that you had decided of your own free will to leave him. He stood on that dais, believing that the woman he had soul bound himself to have looked at him and chosen against him in front of the kingdom, and he would not, he could not, drag her back into a bond she had refused. He has the strongest sense of consent of any wolf I have ever known. It is the cleanest thing in him. His voice cracked. And it has nearly destroyed him. The kitchen swam. Tell me, she whispered. He has not slept in any bed but the floor of the throne room since the night you left. He will not have his bedchamber cleaned because your scent is still in it. The council is fracturing around him because they cannot understand a king who has gone soft and gone savage in the same season. The Halvists have already petitioned for an inquiry into his fitness to rule. Auric leaned forward. Lord Dreven moved the petition 3 weeks ago. Lady Malus has been seen on his arm in the lesser court. They are not subtle. They have not needed to be subtle, because everyone in Caravash believes their version of you, that you were a peasant who climbed too high and lost her nerve. The blood mark on her wrist flared, a sudden bright animal heat, as if something on the other end of the bond had just snapped its head up. She gasped. He feels you, Auric said. Every hour of every day since you walked through the river gate. He has not known where you were. He has only known that you were alive, and that you were south of him, and that you were in pain. I am here because my king is no longer fit to be left alone with himself. I am here because if you do not at least know the truth before deciding what to do with it, I will not have done my duty as his beta. She found that she was crying. He thinks I left him because I wanted to. Yes, my lady. For 5 months. Yes. A small, terrible sound came out of her throat. She put both hands across the curve where the children kicked, both of them, both sides, the way they did when something inside her went very still and very loud at once. Outside the cottage, far off, in the green silence of the grey moor, she heard a sound she had not heard since the night she walked away from the palace. A wolf was howling, somewhere west of the village. One long note, rising. It was answered. From the north this time, then from the south, then from somewhere closer, somewhere just beyond the eastern fields, somewhere very near her cottage. Auric went very still. My lady, he said, and his voice had changed. Those are not my men. The next sound was the splintering of her garden gate. The first arrow came through her front window. Seneca was on the floor before she understood that she had moved. Auric had thrown himself across the table and tackled her sideways with a speed that had no business in a man his age, and the two of them went down hard against the kitchen flagstones. Above them, where her head had been a heartbeat earlier, an iron-tipped bolt had buried itself 2 inches deep in the timber of the far wall. The fletching was black. The point was wet with something dark that was not blood. Down, Auric snarled, already rolling off her. Stay down, my lady, on your hands, away from the windows now. She crawled. Her belly was heavy and her dress was tangled around her knees, but she crawled because the man telling her to crawl had the kind of voice you obeyed before your mind had time to argue. She got herself behind the heavy oak chest beside the hearth and pressed her back against it. A second bolt punched through the kitchen door. How many? She gasped. At least 4 shooters. Auric had drawn a long knife from somewhere inside his coat. His gray eyes were very calm in a way that frightened her more than panic would have. My men at the bridge are dead, my lady. We must assume that. They drove you to my door. Yes, Halvest hunters. Halvest hunters. Outside, a wolf screamed. Pain and fury together, stretched into a long, ragged note that ended in a wet snap. Then there were paws on her roof. The whole cottage shuddered. Something heavy and four-legged was crossing her shingles in slow, deliberate steps, looking for the soft place to come through. Get behind the hearth, Oric said. Into the corner. There is a line of iron in the chimney stones that may slow them. You cannot fight 4 wolves alone. I do not need to win. I need to give you time. Time for what? For him. She stared at him. He is coming. He has been coming since the moment you cried. And he was not far when he started. The only question is whether I can keep your door closed until he arrives. Above their heads, the ceiling buckled inward. A black furred body tore through the thatch and the rafters in a rain of splinters, hit the floor in a crouch, and rose up on its hind legs into something between a man and a wolf, all sinew and yellow eyes and a long curved blade in one clawed hand. The half-shift. The old battle form, banned in the kingdom for 200 years for the things it had done in the wars before her grandmother's grandmother. The Halvists had sent 4 of them into a midwife's cottage on a Thursday afternoon. Oric did not hesitate. He went straight for the thing's throat. The fight was a blur. The flash of his knife, the spray of dark blood across her whitewashed wall, the half-wolf's long arm catching the old beta across the ribs and flinging him into the kitchen table so hard the table broke beneath him. Oric came up again, slower, one arm hanging wrong, his face streaked with red. He planted himself between her corner and the half-wolf and raised his knife a second time. The half-wolf laughed. A wet clicking sound. It came forward. She felt the second one slipping in through the splintered front door, and the third dropping through the same hole in the roof, and somewhere very far away the fourth circling the back of the cottage. Oric was about to die in front of her. She would die after him. The children inside her would die last and without ever having drawn a single breath of their own. Something in her chest broke open. It was not fear. It was not even rage. Although rage was in it, it was older than either. It was the thing her grandmother had told her about on a kitchen floor in Briarwen Hollow when she was 9 years old, and had held a dead bird in her hands and seen, suddenly, how the bird had loved the wind. The sight, but not the small sight she had used since girlhood, something larger. Something that had been growing in her along with the children, fed by a soul binding the world had told her was broken, and it rose now because its mother was about to be murdered, and it had decided, all on its own, that this would not happen. She put her hand flat against the floor and let it out. It went into the stones first. The cottage stones remembered everything. The woman who had laid them 60 years ago, her son who had patched them, the seasons of cooking and bleeding and birthing they had hosted. All of that memory was hers to hold, and hers to pour. The kitchen filled with light. It was not gold. It was not silver. It was the soft, particular gray of memory itself, and it rose out of every stone in the cottage at once, and where it touched the half-wolves they screamed. They had not expected memory. They were creatures of the present moment, of the simple animal wanting. They had no defenses against the weight of what a small gray cottage had remembered for 60 years. The first half-wolf staggered. The second clutched at its own face. The third dropped its blade and tried to run for the door, and the door was full of gray light too, and the door did not let it pass. Oric, on his knees, was staring at her with his mouth open. "Get up," Seneca said. Her voice was not entirely her own. It had layers in it now, harmonics, like a chord struck on a deep instrument. "Oric Tarson, get up. We are leaving." He got up. She walked across the kitchen with her hand out, and the half-wolves cringed back from her fingertips, and she did not stop until she had reached him and put her shoulder under his good arm. Together they crossed the ruin of her front room toward the broken door. The gray light moved with her. Where it touched the shafts of the black-fletched arrows still embedded in her walls, the shafts crumbled to dust. She stepped over the threshold of her cottage for the last time. The garden was full of wolves. Not halvest hunters, not half-shifts, real wolves. 20, perhaps 30, in a loose circle around the cottage, their eyes pale and fixed and patient. They were waiting. And as Seneca stepped into the late afternoon light with the old beta leaning against her shoulder and the gray memory light still trailing from her like smoke, the circle parted. In the gap, on the trampled grass of her herb beds, a single wolf stood. It was the size of a draft horse. Its fur was the matte black of a night with no moon. Its shoulders were so heavy with muscle they made the line of its back look like a ridge. And its eyes, fixed on her across 20 yards of ruined garden, were the deep amber of pine resin held to a flame. Seneca stopped breathing. The black wolf took one step toward her, then another. Then it was running, and it crossed the garden in 3 bounds and skidded to a stop 2 feet in front of her, and it dropped, all at once, onto its belly. It pressed its enormous head into the curve of her unhurt side, and the blood mark on her wrist went white hot, and from somewhere deep inside the wolf came a sound she had never heard in her life. It was a whimper. Varian Costa, Alpha King of Andreth, was on his belly in her garden, whimpering against her dress. The change took him slowly. She felt it happen against her body, the long bones rearranging, the fur retracting, the heat rising and falling. And then it was a man kneeling in her garden with both arms wrapped around her hips, and his forehead pressed to her belly, and his shoulders shaking. He was filthy. He was thinner than she remembered. There was a streak of gray at his right temple that had not been there 5 months ago. He did not speak. He just held on. Seneca looked down at the dark head pressed to the swell of her belly, and at the blood mark still pulsing white in the late summer light, and at the old beta beside her with tears running unhidden down his face. Her hand moved, slowly, against her own will, and came to rest on the back of Varian's head. His shoulders shook harder. "You came," she said. Her voice was very small. "I would have come if it had taken 100 years," he said into her dress. "I would have come if you had told me to stop." She closed her eyes. The sun was beginning to go down over the gray moor. Somewhere, far off, more wolves were howling, and these ones were not in pain. These ones were calling to each other across a kingdom, the way wolves did when something lost had been found. Seneca kept her hand on the back of his head, and she did not yet know what she would do. But she did not, at that moment, take her hand away. The cottage was no longer fit for human use, but it was the only roof they had. Oryx stayed outside with the wolves. He had refused her offer to bind his ribs, and when she had pressed him on it, he had answered, very quietly, that there were things her king needed to say to her that no third pair of ears should hear. Then he had walked out into the wreck of her garden with his good arm pressed against his bad one, and he had set himself to the watch. So she was alone with Varian. He had not let go of her since the garden. Even when she had walked him into the kitchen, even when she had pressed him gently down onto the one chair that was still standing, his hand had stayed wrapped around her wrist where the blood mark was, as if he were afraid she would dissolve out of his grip the moment he loosened it. She knelt in front of his chair so that her face was level with his. Varian. It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud in 5 months. The shape of it in her mouth was a small earthquake. He closed his eyes when she said it. A muscle in his jaw worked. "Say it again. Varian, look at me." He looked. His eyes were not the eyes she remembered. The amber was the same. Everything around the amber had changed. Hollows beneath his cheekbones where there had been none. Small lines at the corners of his eyes that would not smooth back out. A thin white scar across his left brow that was new since the spring. He had been a very beautiful king. He was now a very beautiful ruin. "You let me go." His mouth opened, then closed. "You stood on the dais. You watched me set the circlet down. You watched me walk out. Varian, you did not say one word to stop me. I did not believe I had the right." His voice was a piece of split wood. "You said you renounced freely. You said you renounced without coercion. If I had crossed that hall and put my hands on you and pulled you back to me, I would have been making the words you spoke into a lie. And I have never, in the whole of my life, taken anything from you that you did not place into my hand." She stared at him. "You let me leave because you thought I had decided. Yes, for 5 months, you let me sit in the Greymoor with our children inside me, because you thought I had decided. Yes. Varian, Her voice cracked. I read letters in your desk. 3 days before the reckoning, I was looking for a quill. I opened the drawer you had given me a key to. There were 6 letters in your hand and your seal. They were addressed to Malus Halvest. They said I was useful only as long as the council believed the soul binding. They said the day after the reckoning she would take her place beside you. They said until then I must be made to feel chosen. His face had gone the color of bone. I did not write those letters. I know that now, Auric told me. Seneca. His grip had become almost painful. I have never written a letter to that woman in my life. I have spoken her name aloud perhaps 4 times in 5 years, and 3 of them were to refuse her father's proposals. I would sooner write love letters to a wall. I know. Do you know? She did not answer with her voice. She turned her wrist beneath his hand, palm up, and laid her other hand flat across his open palm so that the blood mark and his calluses were pressed together. Then she let the sight rise. It came easier this time. It had been waking in her since the garden. She did not show him the letters as words. The sight did not work that way. She showed him what she had felt when she had read them. The cold seizing of her stomach, the way the ink had seemed to crawl, the terrible mathematical clarity of being made small, the way she had folded each one and put it back in the drawer, and walked out of his study, and stood in the corridor with one hand against the wall, telling herself again and again that it was not real. She let him feel the moment she had stopped telling herself that. Varian made a sound she had heard from injured animals. Her hand was trembling. He bent forward until his forehead rested against the back of her wrist, and after a long moment she realized he was weeping into her skin. I would have torn the palace down, he said into her wrist. If you had brought one of those letters to me, I would have torn it down stone by stone with my own hands until I found whose ink it was. I did not know I could trust you to do that. And I gave you no reason to know it. I had Dreven Halvest in my private chambers 4 times that month. He came in and out as if they belonged to him. His voice broke. Of course you read them and believe them, because I had let the man who hated you nearest the desk where I keep my truths. Varian. It was my failure. It was a forgery. It was a forgery I made possible. He lifted his head, and his eyes were red. I have been bleeding for it ever since. Bleeding. He let go and reached up to unbutton the high collar of his travel coat, pulling it open at the throat. The blood mark, there was a wound, not a scar, not a healed thing. The bite he had given her on her wrist had a twin on the side of his throat, and that twin had reopened. The skin around it was raw and weeping a slow, dark red that had soaked into the linen of his shirt. Every full moon, he said, since you left. It opens and it bleeds for 2 days, and then it closes, and it waits. The court physician believes I am dying. He may be right. He looked at her steadily. A renounced bond should fade. Mine has not faded because you renounced it from your side, and I refuse to renounce it from mine. The cost of refusing is on my throat. I have decided I am willing to pay it. She put both of her hands over her mouth. You could have ended it. You could have closed it from your side. You would not have been bleeding for 5 months, Varian. Yes. Why did you not? He smiled. It was a terrible smile. Because if I closed my side, I would never have known the moment you decided to come back. She moved without deciding to. She came up off the floor and put her hands on either side of his face, and she kissed him, hard, on the mouth. With her thumbs pressed into the hollows beneath his cheekbones and her own tears wetting both of their faces, he made a noise in his throat and pulled her down into his lap and held her there. The kiss was not a tender thing. It was a thing 2 people did who had been holding their breath for 150 days. It tasted of salt and copper, and the thin, sharp clarity of something said too late and said anyway. When she pulled back, his hands were shaking against her ribs. I want to tell you something, and you have to be very still while I tell you. Tell me. She put his hand on the curve of her stomach. He went perfectly still. The child on the right kicked first, then the child on the left. Varian did not move a single muscle for the space of 7 long breaths. His amber eyes had gone enormous. His hand against her was so careful it might have been resting on a soap bubble. Seneca, he said, in a voice that was not quite working. 2 of them. 2. Yes. They are. He stopped. He swallowed. They are mine. They are yours. They were yours when you left. They were. You were going to. I was going to tell you the night of the reckoning. He bent his face down against her hair, and she felt the long shudder go through him from his shoulders to his hands, and she held him against her belly while their children kicked at the warm weight of his palm. The cottage door opened. Oric did not come in. He stood in the doorway with his good hand on the jamb, and he did not look at the two of them tangled in the broken chair, and he spoke as if he were addressing no one in particular. My king, a rider has come up the south road. He carries a sealed letter from Caravash. Lady Halvest has called a tribunal of fitness. The council convenes in 3 days. If you are not in the city by sunset of the 3rd day, the regency passes to her father by default. Your kingdom will belong to him by Friday. Varian's hand on her belly did not move. My lady asked me to bleed for her for 5 months. He said quietly to the ceiling. I will not let her bleed alone for 3 more days. He looked down at her. Will you ride with me? To the city you renounced me in. She thought about her cottage. About Pell. About a man bleeding once a month from a wound he had refused to close. I will ride, she said. The wagon was a poor thing. Oric had bargained for it from a tinker in the next village, and the tinker had not asked questions because he had been paid in the kind of silver that makes questions inconvenient. It had a canvas roof patched in 3 places, 2 stubborn mules, and a bed of straw that smelled faintly of last summer's hay. Seneca sat in the back on a folded blanket with her knees drawn up. Varian rode beside the wagon for the first hour, then gave his horse to one of his outriders and shifted into the black wolf and ran alongside instead. There were 8 wolves in the escort. 4 ahead, 4 behind, and Oric on the box beside the driver with his bandaged ribs and his old sword across his knees. Twice on the first night they had to stop. The second time was because Varian had shifted back to a man on the bank of a stream, dripping from the change, and walked to the wagon and climbed in without asking. And Oric had ordered the driver to halt and had taken himself for a long, deliberate walk down the road with his hand on his sword and his eyes very firmly on the moon. In the back of the wagon, Varian wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and sat across from her, knees drawn up, and watched her. Show me, she said quietly. He did not pretend not to know what she meant. He let the blanket fall from his throat. The wound had begun to bleed again. It must have been the running. The skin was wet and dark. A thin trickle had crept down his collarbone and dried there. She moved across the wagon bed, slowly, because the children were heavy in her now, and knelt in front of him in the straw. This is going to feel strange. Nothing about you has ever felt strange. She put her palm flat over the wound. The sight rose easily now. She let it sink down through her hand and into the broken edge of the bond, and held it there. Not pulling, not pushing, just being present with the wound, the way a midwife is present with a body that has forgotten how to do its work. The mark had been bleeding because it had been refused. She did not refuse it. She offered it the simple memory of itself, and after a long moment, the wound began, very slowly, to close. When she lifted her hand, the skin beneath was a clean silver line. Varian touched it himself, disbelieving. His fingers came away dry. You closed it. You closed it. You decided to let me close it. That is a thinner distinction than you think. It is the only distinction that matters. He looked at her for a long time. The wagon swayed. The mules walked. He reached out and put his hand, very gently, on her side where one of the children was kicking. Tell me about them. So she told him. About the first time she had felt them move, in a turnip cart on the road south, a flutter she had mistaken for hunger. About the morning she had pressed both hands to the curve of her stomach and felt 2 distinct rhythms answer her, 2 pairs of feet, and known. About counting moons. About the dreams in which a child she had not yet met asked her, in his voice, whether his father was a kind man. He stopped her there. What did you tell him? That his father was the kindest man I had ever known. And then I woke up and was furious with myself for hours. He laughed. It was a wet, broken laugh. He bent his head down to the curve of her belly and pressed his mouth there, and one of the children kicked his lower lip, and he made a sound she thought she would remember on the day she died. The wagon rolled on. They reached the outskirts of Karavash on the second night. The city did not look right. From the high road, Seneca could see the long sweep of the river and the spires of the palace, and on 3 of the high towers the banners had been changed. Varian saw it before she did. He was back in the wagon for the last leg, dressed now, his throat freshly bandaged for show, looking out the back canvas flap. "Halvis colors," he said. "On the south tower. On the west tower. On the water gate." "He has not waited the 3 days," Oryx said grimly from the box. "No, he has not." A horseman came down the road toward them. One of Varian's couriers, riding alone, his cloak streaked with dust. He drew up beside the wagon and bent low over his saddle, and what he said made Seneca's hand close around the side of the wagon hard enough to splinter the wood. "My king, they have taken the old nurse." Varian's whole body went still. "Brida?" he said. "Yes. 2 days ago. Charge of harboring a fugitive consort, willful obstruction of the council, and conspiracy to defraud the tribunal. Lord Dreven has called for her to be questioned at dawn. He has personally requested that the questioning be public." Seneca had known Brida well. The old woman had served as the keeper of the consort's quarters in Seneca's first month at the palace. She had brought her tea on her hardest nights, and on Seneca's last morning in Karavash, she had pressed a small cloth bundle of dried herbs into her hand and whispered for the sickness, "Child, the kind that comes in the morning." And she had said nothing else, and she had told no one, and she had not stopped not telling them for 5 months. For 5 months, an old woman had carried her pregnancy as her own private secret, and now she was going to die for it in a public square at dawn. Seneca could not feel her face. "Varian, I know. I am going. I know. Not into hiding. Into the hall. I know." He turned to look at her. There was something in his eyes she had not seen before, closer to recognition. As if a thing he had been carrying alone for a long time had just been lifted, very gently, from his shoulder by another pair of hands. "You will go before the tribunal." "Yes. You renounced the circlet in that hall." "I did. You are now going to walk back into the same hall and tell them what was done to you." "Yes." He took her hand. "Seneca of Briarwin Hollow," he said quietly. "I have never in my life loved anything as much as I love the thing you are about to do." The wagon rolled on toward the gates of Karavash. In the lower cells of the palace, an old woman was sitting on a stone bench, listening to the bells of the city ring the 3rd hour past midnight, and she was not afraid. She had told the questioners nothing. She would tell them nothing. She had decided, on the morning Seneca had walked into a hall and renounced a king, that there were some kinds of silence an old woman could afford to keep, and she had kept hers. She did not yet know that she was about to be saved. The Hall of Bound Oaths was full again. It had taken less than 4 hours after the wagon rolled through the river gate for the news to spread, and by the time the sun came up, every member of the council, every great house lord still in residence, every senior officer of the city watch, and a packed gallery of common citizens had crammed themselves into the long marble hall. The dais had a new occupant. Lord Dreven Halvis sat in the regent's seat, his silver-streaked dark hair combed flat against his skull, his long council robes of slate gray draped over a chair that did not belong to him. Beside him stood his daughter Malus, in a gown of pale ice blue that was, Seneca noted with a calm she did not entirely own, extremely close in color to the consort's robes a queen-to-be would wear. The presumption was breathtaking. Seneca stood at the foot of the dais in the same silk gown she had renounced him in. Varian was beside her on her left. Oryx was on her right, his sword sheathed but his hand on the pommel. Behind them, in a long line filling the center aisle, stood 22 members of Varian's personal guard. The hall was very quiet. "Lord Dreven," Varian said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "You are sitting in a chair that was not given to you. Stand up." Dreven smiled. It was the polite smile of a man who had spent his life ensuring that polite smiles cost him nothing. "My king, you are aware, I trust, of the petition of fitness lodged with this council. Until the petition is resolved, the regent's seat is held in trust by the senior council member. That is myself. I will return your seat to you the moment this body declares you fit. He inclined his head with elaborate care. I expect that will be soon. You will return my seat now. I will return your seat when the tribunal has heard its evidence. Varian's hand on Seneca's elbow tightened. She felt, through the bond, the precise shape of what he was holding in. She put her own hand over his and pressed once. He let her step forward. Then let the tribunal hear its evidence, she said, and let it begin with mine. The hall went perfectly silent. She turned, slowly, to address not Drevin but the council benches, the great houses, the gallery. Her voice did not shake. 5 months ago I stood in this hall and renounced the consort's circlet of Andrith. I told you I did so freely. I did so because, 3 days before the reckoning, I read 6 letters in the king's private study, written in his hand, sealed with his ring, addressed to Malus Halvest. The letters told me I was a piece on a board. The letters told me my soul binding was a play put on for the council. She turned her head and looked, for the first time, at Drevin. Those letters were forged. Drevin's smile did not move. His eyes did. That is a serious accusation, Lady Seneca. I am no longer a lady. I renounce the title in this hall. Then it is a serious accusation, Wenna of Hollowgate, or whatever name you have been hiding under. A small, shocked sound went through the gallery. She did not flinch. Then I will prove the accusation, she said, in a way this council has not seen in 3 generations. She held up her right hand, palm out. My grandmother was Ysera of Briarwen Hollow. The ashen site was her gift, and her mother's mother. It is the gift of reading what living hands leave behind on dead objects. It has been forbidden in the high courts for 170 years because it is inconvenient to the kind of men who write things they do not wish to be remembered for. Her voice rose, just slightly. I am invoking the ancient right of memory witness in this tribunal. Bring the letters. Varian had brought them, all 6, in a sealed leather case he had personally retrieved from his desk in the early hours before dawn. Auric now stepped forward and laid the case on the long oak witness table at the foot of the dais. The senior council elder, an old woman in dark gray named Eshana Vol, rose from her bench. She looked from Seneca to Drevin to Varian and back to Seneca. Her mouth pressed into a line. The right of memory witness, she said slowly, has not been invoked in this hall since my grandfather's grandfather. But it has not been struck from the rolls. The court is bound to allow it. Her gray eyes rested on Drevin. Lord Halvest, do you object? Drevin's smile slipped, just for half a heartbeat. I object to nothing the council finds lawful. Then it is lawful. Seneca opened the case. She lifted the first letter. She placed her palm flat against the page. She let the sight rise, and this time she did not hold it inside herself. She let it pour up out of her hand and into the air above the table, and the hall gasped, because the gray light that had filled her cottage in the Greymoor was now filling the hall of bound oaths. It rose in slow curls toward the painted ceiling, and inside the light, like a shape forming in fog, the council saw a hand. It was not Varian's hand. He had thick, calloused fingers and a small old scar across the back of his right knuckle from a sword fight in his 22nd year. The hand in the gray light was narrower. The fingers were longer. There was an opal ring on the smallest finger. There was, on the back of the wrist, the small, pale crescent birthmark that every member of House Halvest carried. The hand was writing the letter. Seneca did not need to say whose hand it was. The hall did the work for her. A single sharp sound went up from the gallery, and then a wave of murmuring, and then a council elder on the far bench rose to his feet, with his hand clamped over his mouth. And then Eshana Vol turned her head very slowly toward Drevin Halvest, and her expression was no longer impartial. Drevin stood up. This is theater. This is a peasant trick. The girl is a witch. She is creating an illusion, and any of you who believes it is a fool. Lord Halvest, Eshana said quietly, sit down. I will not sit down. I will not be witnessed by a midwife's hand magic. I will not. It was Malus who moved. Seneca did not see her draw the dagger. None of them saw her draw it. Malus Halvest had been standing perfectly still beside her father's chair for the entire proceeding, and then in one motion she was off the dais and across the floor, and the dagger was in her hand, and the dagger was the same dark, wet metal Seneca had last seen on the tip of an arrow in her cottage roof. The blade came at her belly. Varian roared. Auric lunged. The guards at the back of the hall surged forward, but they were 30 feet away, and Malus was 4 feet away, and the dagger was already moving. She turned. It was not a thought. It was an old instinct. She turned her body so that the blade did not meet her belly. It met her side instead, low and just above her hip, and the metal went in with a thin, cold shock that did not, at first, hurt at all. Then it hurt. The world slowed. She saw Malus's face very clearly in the gray light, the mouth open in a scream of pure fury. She saw Varian's hand close around Malus's throat from behind. She saw the dagger leave her side, dragged out by Malus's falling weight, and the dark, wet metal was now painted with her own blood. The poison was already in her. It went into her hip first, and then it began to climb. The hall was screaming. She fell to one knee. Her hand went, automatically, not to the wound but to the curve of her stomach, and the children inside her were not kicking. They had gone perfectly still, the way small creatures go still when something has come very close. Varian was there. He was on his knees in front of her. He had her face in both his hands. He was saying her name over and over, and his voice was a thing she had never heard him make before. And somewhere far away, Auric was shouting for the court physician, and somewhere even further away, Eshanavol was ordering the guard to take Drevin Halvest into custody, and the gray light was still hanging in the air above the table, slowly beginning to fade. She looked up at Varian's terrified face. Both of them, she whispered, are still. Then the cold reached her heart, and the world tilted, and the hall of bound oaths went dark. The dark was not empty. She had expected, when the cold reached her heart, that there would be nothing on the other side, that she would simply stop. Instead, she found herself in a place that was not quite a place, gray, textured like remembered weather, full of small, bright things drifting around her like sparks rising off a banked fire. She lifted her hand to look at it. Her hand was a child's hand. She was 9 years old. She was standing on the kitchen floor of her grandmother's cottage in Briarwen Hollow with a dead sparrow in her palm, and her grandmother was kneeling in front of her saying, "What does it remember? My heart, what does it remember?" The memory faded. She was 20, riding into Caravache on the back of a midwife's cart, looking up at the spires of the palace for the first time. The memory faded. She was 22. Varian Costa sitting across from her in a small kitchen off the south wing, eating bread she had baked, laughing because she had said something stupid about the way his second cousin held a fork. And she was watching him laugh and understanding, with a calm horror, that her life had just rearranged itself around the sound. The memories were going by faster. She understood, dimly, that this was what dying was. The sight had risen to take her home, and the way it would take her home was through the door of every memory she had ever made. She did not want to go. She put both hands on her belly in the gray place that was not a place, and the swell was still there, and she could feel them, somehow, both of them, very still, very small. They were not gone. Not yet. Stay, she said to them. They answered in a small, soft pulse of light, one from her right side and one from her left, 2 little candles in the gray. And she pressed her palms against them and thought, with the whole of her ruined self, "We are not finished yet." A new light came. It came from outside her, from the world she had thought she was leaving. It poured in through a crack in the gray, deep amber in color, shaped like a hand reaching. She knew the hand. She had loved that hand. She reached toward it, and the amber hand closed around her gray one, and somewhere very far away, in a hall of black marble pillars, Varian Costa was on his knees with his palms pressed against her wound, and he was opening every door in himself that was still capable of being opened. She felt the moment he made the offer. It was not words. It was a thing that happened in his chest, the breaking open of a held thing. He was pouring it into her. Not the blood mark, the thing beneath the blood mark. He was emptying himself into the wound at her hip and into the cold, black place in her chest where the poison had reached. the way a man pours water on a fire he cannot bear to watch burn. She tried to push him away. He was giving her too much. He was giving her the part he could not survive without. Varian, she said into the gray. Varian, stop. You will not have anything left. I would rather have nothing, his voice said back, than be the man who let you go a second time. The gray began to retreat. By inches. The cold pulled back from her heart first, then from her ribs, then from her stomach. The two small candles inside her flared brighter, and she understood, with a kind of late awe, that the children were taking what he was giving and using it and making more of it. Their gift was not hers. It was something newer, something his bond and her gift had made together, in the dark of her body, over 5 months of being told it would not survive, and it was alive now, and it was helping her live. The poison did not vanish. It thinned. It became something the body could carry. The gray pulled back from her hip last. She opened her eyes. The Hall of Bound Oaths had become a tableau. Time had stopped while she was gone, or it had not stopped and she had simply been too far away to feel it move. Eshana Vol was halfway down the dais steps. Auric was halfway across the floor with his hand outstretched. The court physician was on one knee, with a satchel half unbuckled. Varian was bent over her with his face pressed into the side of her neck, and he was not breathing. She lifted one weak hand and pressed it against the back of his head. He went still in a different way. Then his shoulders began to shake. Varian, I am here. He made a noise. It was not a word. It was the noise a man makes when something enormous and silent inside he has finally been allowed to rest. The court physician got to her first. He pressed his fingers to her neck, then to her wrist, then, very carefully, to the side of her belly. His old face was wet. He did not bother to pretend it was not. My king, he said hoarsely. She lives. They live. All three of them. The Hall of Bound Oaths erupted. Seneca did not see most of what happened next. Varian had picked her up off the floor in his arms and was carrying her toward the high doors, with Auric clearing a path in front of him, and 22 of the king's personal guard closing ranks around her like a moving wall. She could hear Eshana Vol's voice rising over the chaos, ordering Dreven Halvest taken to the lower cells, ordering Malus Halvest restrained on charges of attempted murder of the king's intended and conspiracy against the crown, ordering the hall sealed and the tribunal recessed indefinitely. Varian carried her up 3 flights of stairs to a bedchamber that smelled, faintly, of her. He had not let it be cleaned. The court physician had told her so on the road. She had not believed it until she walked into the room in his arms and saw the small wooden comb on the side table where she had set it down, and her shawl folded on the back of the chair, and the dried sprig of lavender in the pewter cup on the windowsill that she had picked from the palace garden on a morning that felt now like another woman's life. He laid her down on the bed. She caught his sleeve. Show me. He pulled the collar of his shirt away from his throat. The blood mark was a clean silver line. It had not opened. It had not bled. In the long minutes she had been in the gray, it had sealed itself into the proper finished thing it had always been meant to be. The mark on her own wrist had done the same. They were matched. 2 thin silver crescents that would now be there for the rest of their lives and would not, any more, hurt. She lifted her wrist beside his throat so he could see them together. Lie down, beside me. I am perfectly well. Varian Costa. Lie down. He lay down. She put her head on his shoulder, and within the space of 10 breaths, Varian, who had not properly slept in 5 months, was asleep against her hair. The trial took 3 weeks. Lord Dreven Halvest was tried before the full council on charges of high forgery, conspiracy against the crown, attempted regicide by political fraud, and the unlawful commissioning of half-shift assassins. Half-shift had been outlawed in Andraith for 2 centuries. Seneca herself testified. Twice, calmly, with the leather case of letters in front of her, and her hand resting on it. She used the sight again, in court. On 3 more documents Dreven had thought destroyed, and read the writing hands of 2 of his lieutenants off them, and the lieutenants confessed within the hour. Dreven was executed on a gray morning at the eastern wall. Malus was not executed. Seneca had asked, quietly, that her life be spared. Not out of mercy. She had told Varian one night in the candlelight of his rooms. Out of something harder, Malus had wanted to be queen. The cleanest punishment was to let her live the rest of her life as the woman who had not become queen, in a small holding in the far western marshes, with her name struck from the rolls of her house. Brida was brought up from the lower cells the same day Seneca came back to the palace. The old woman had walked into the antechamber of the king's apartments under her own power, refusing every offered arm, and when she had seen Seneca sitting in a chair by the fire, she had stopped in the doorway and folded her own hands together very tightly and had said, in a voice that was the only thing in the room not steady, "I am pleased to find you well, my lady." Seneca had crossed the room and put her arms around her. Brida had not cried in front of the questioners. She did not cry now. She did, however, hold on for a long time. The kingdom healed slowly. The banners on the South Tower came down within a day. The banners on the West Tower took a week. The banner on the Watergate was the last to come down because it had been replaced by a crew of common boys for sport and they did not want to give it up. And Varian had been amused enough by their stubbornness to let them keep it for one more week. Seneca did not return to the consort's apartments. She returned to the king's. The reckoning was scheduled for the first new moon of autumn. It was held, by her request, in the Hall of Bound Oaths. The same hall, the same painted ceiling, the same long aisle she had once walked down with a circlet in her hands. This time she walked it with her hand in his. She was very pregnant by then. The court tailor had despaired and made her a gown that was less a gown than a kind of forgiving, flowing cloud. She walked down the aisle with the slow weight of two children inside her, and Varian on her left, and Auric on her right, and Brida walking just behind her with the silver consort's circlet on a small dark cushion, and when she reached the foot of the dais, she did not stop. She climbed the 7 steps. She turned at the top to face the hall. "My lords and ladies of Andreth, my elders, my king," she looked at Varian when she said the last word. "5 months ago I stood at the bottom of these steps and set down a circlet that had been offered to me freely. I told you I had decided. I had not. I had been deceived. I have come back to take up what I set down, with full knowledge of what I am taking, and with full knowledge that it was offered without coercion the first time, and is offered without coercion now." Brida came up the steps with the cushion. Seneca lifted the circlet with both hands. She set it on her own head. The Hall of Bound Oaths rose to its feet. The council elders rose first, then the great house lords, then the gallery, then the citizens at the back. There was no shouting. There was a long, deep gathered silence, the kind that was its own kind of noise, and through it, she looked down from the dais at the man she had loved, and would now, finally, properly, marry. Varian climbed the 7 steps. He stopped 1 step below her, so that she was, for the first time in their lives, the taller of the two. "My queen, my king." The twins were born on the 18th night of autumn. The boy came first. He had her grandmother's gray eyes, and he was quiet and watchful from his very first breath. The girl came second. She had her father's amber eyes and her mother's small, fierce mouth, and she came into the world with a noise of complaint that the midwife later described as frankly editorial. Varian held both of them at once, one in each arm, while Seneca watched him from the bed. "They will have the sight," she said quietly. "Both of them. I felt it in the gray place. Then they will be the first wolves in 300 years to inherit it. Yes. And our daughter will probably be the most difficult queen this kingdom has ever had." "Almost certainly." He bent down and pressed his forehead to hers. "Seneca of Briarwyn Hollow," he said, "you walked into a hall full of strangers and renounced me to my face for what you believed was my own good. I have decided I am willing to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. Varian, that is all. I had a longer one and I forgot it." She laughed. It was the first true laugh that had come out of her body in nearly a year. He grinned down at her with both children sleeping in his arms, and outside the high windows, the autumn moon was coming up over Caravash, full and clean, and very white. On her wrist, the silver crescent caught the light. On his throat, the matching crescent caught it back. 2 small evidences that a thing had been broken, and put down, and picked up, and put back together by the hands of the people it belonged to. They would not bleed again. Outside the palace, an old hound lifted its head and howled, just once, into the autumn air. From the east wall, another wolf answered. Then from the south. Then from the high pines beyond the river. The kingdom of Andreth was singing its slow, nightly chord into the dark, and the chord was, for the first time in many seasons, in tune. In the king's bedchamber, the Queen of Andreth closed her eyes against the warm shoulder of the man she had loved through grief and forgery, and a public renunciation, and a wagon ride, and a poisoned dagger, and she slept. She had come home the long way. She had come home anyway.